All right, hi everyone, and welcome to Bakin Shakin with Washington Red Raspberries. We're honored to partner with Washington Red Raspberry Commission on this class series and to demonstrate various applications of frozen red raspberry formats for industry professionals like you and, well, like us. I'm Zach Miller, the Baking and Pastry Arts instructor here at the New Orleans Culinary and Hospitality Institute, which is a mouthful. That's why we go by Gnocchi. And today I'm very fortunate to be joined by Graison Gill of Bellegarde Bakery. Today's session is going to be focused on bread. But before we get started, let's take a look at the story behind Washington Red Raspberries, which make up 90% of the nation's frozen red raspberry crop.
My dad started this farm in '77. We grew up running around in the berry fields, and raspberries run deep in our veins.
You just have to deal with what Mother Nature gives you every year, and every year is different.
I'm passionate about doing the best job that we can to get a prime berry to share with the world.
Before we get going too far, I want to talk a little bit about some of the formats that you got in the mail that and some of them that we're going to be using today. You'll see your whole IQF. You've got your whole and broken that you've received as well. And we're using, actually, I'll go backtrack a little bit. The holes we're going to be using today in the baguette, and you'll see that. You also have the frozen seedless puree that you got as well. We're using that in the fougasse today. Is that right, Chef? Yeah. Great. We have the dehydrated fragments, which are a lot of fun as well, and dehydrated powder. Now, there are other different types of formats as well. You'll find those on page 15 and 16 of the packet that you got. But really some fantastic things to play around with, and really some fantastic flavors. So we'll introduce Chef Graison here, and we'll get right into it because there's a lot to talk about today. So I'm going to introduce Chef Graison here. Great, welcome to Gnocchi.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this, and I'm just going to hand it off to you and let you tell us about kind of what you do, and a little bit about your bakery, and then obviously about the delicious product you're going to be making today.
Cool. Thanks for everybody for joining us today. Obviously this is really awkward, I'm sure, for y'all and also for me. I've taught in all sorts of circumstances all over the world, but nothing quite like this today. So I know that y'all have the chat option. I hope that we can go through and get intros to the students as well too after I give this intro. And if you have any further questions for me, just feel free to reach out for my contact information to ask. But as Zach said, my name is Graison. I have a bakery here in New Orleans called Bellegarde. It's currently closed because of COVID. We closed about 2.5 weeks ago and hope to reopen I don't know, sometime this fall, but financially the burden and the stress of the situation going on in New Orleans and throughout the country was just too much for us financially and emotionally, so we decided to close on July 25th. I've been baking in New Orleans for 11 years. Baking's my career and my hobby and my passion. I've never done really anything else. I started working in kitchens as a kid when I was about 14 years old, 15 years old, and haven't done anything else besides that. So I started baking when I moved to New Orleans in 2009 and opened up Bellegarde in late 2012. So it's been about 8 years now. Primarily, we're a wholesale bakery. So on an average day, we were seeing about 60, 65 customers a day, 6 days a week, selling bread, flour, pasta. And then when we reopened partially this summer, we were seeing about 10 to 12 customers a day, 3 days a week. And I'm sure that all of y'all that are involved with a bakery anywhere else in the country are probably feeling some really similar pain and frustration as well too, emotionally and financially because of the pandemic. Something that defines who I am and what we've done since day one is responding to local ingredients and local traditions and local recipes and local flavors. So it's critical for me. I know that we're here in New Orleans and we're going to be using some corn today. Which is obviously a very local crop here in the South, but also local anywhere else in the United States. It's really critical for me to respond to what's around us, not just on a literal level, but on an emotional and a cultural level as well too. So it's always key for me to use anything that I can that's available locally. So 6 years ago, I started using salt from Avery Island, where they make Tabasco sauce, because I don't want to buy a bag of salt from California if it was available locally. We use an olive oil from San Antonio, Texas. Most of our grains are grown regionally that we mill in-house. In the deep south, we don't really have a good climate for grain cultivation, so we do what we can when it comes to accessing things that are not so much local but regional. But again, it's just critical for us to let what's available to us culturally and historically and regionally define what we do, as opposed to vice versa. So again, it's just really critical for me when I teach to show people what I do and what I believe in terms of our values, our ethics, but most critically to help the students find their own self-expression for what it is that they love and where they're coming from. So today we're using raspberries and we're using pistachios with a bunch of flour that I stone milled in our bakery in New Orleans. But again, I would hope that you can use today's recipes as a trampoline where you can kind of jump off wherever you are to find yourself and your customers and your passion, as opposed to copying these recipes blindly. These are more of a guide for you to explore your own region, your own bakery, your own grains, and your own flavors as well too. The raspberries that we use were great today, but again, like, things are completely mutable and changeable according to your situation. So if you don't like pistachios, like I did a sample trial of the fougasse that we're making today, and I used organic pecans from Louisiana because, again, it's contextual. I just thought for a more national audience, a roasted pistachio paired with the raspberry would go really well. But again, please use things that are contextual to your context, to your customers, and most importantly, to your heart and to your passion too. While we were open, and hopefully when we reopen the bakery, I have two 40-inch stone mills. So before closing, we were milling about 4,000 pounds of flour a week. I'd say 75% of that was for us, for our own consumption, and then the rest of it was for local bakeries or restaurants. And we were also shipping a little bit nationally, not very much. But freshly stone milled flour has always been something really important to me, but kind of like an addiction or like a late night drinking. It started with a really small little splinter, and then it definitely ballooned the past 2, 3, 4 years into me and into us having two huge stone mills basically in the middle of New Orleans. So for those of y'all that don't know, the tip of the iceberg when it comes to flour is just white flour. And as we all know, an iceberg has 1/8 of it exposed above the surface of the water, and 7/8 of that iceberg is underneath the water that we can't see. So a lot of us are acclimated, whether we're children or professionals or lay people that don't bake, all of us think that white flour is flour, but in fact it's the tip of the iceberg to flour. So it's critical for me, again, to going back to what I said earlier, that we use and that we respond to ingredients that are available to us literally or maybe culturally or emotionally. So using different grains, but also ensuring that those grains are milled on a stone mill are critical for me on many levels, economic, ecological, historically as well too. So there's a little bit of roller milled white flour in the baguette recipe today, but in the fougasse recipe, it's 100% stone mill flour. I know that the class participants, you guys are coming from around the country, but there's 3 incredible mills that I love in the States. They're going to be Maine Grains, which is in Maine. Carolina Ground outside of Asheville, Carolina is incredible. And then Nan Kohler that owns Griston Toll Flour in Los Angeles is incredible too. All 3 of them ship. And I would encourage supporting those incredible women doing incredible work with flour, and they've been doing it for years and years. And they all mill incredible flour. They all mill mostly locally or regionally sourced grains as well too on their stone mills. So if anyone has any questions about the flours I used today, because I milled all of them in our stone mill, let me know and I can hopefully point you in a direction of finding them through Nan, Jennifer, or Amber at those 3 mills that I just mentioned. All right. Again, or before we get into things, we're going to go a little bit out of order because the time is really compressed. So I'm going to start by doing a hand mix on the baguette recipe, and then we're going to do, I'm going to demo a shape and a divide on the fougasse and on the baguette recipe. I'm going to bake some pre-shaped fougasse and baguette, and then we're going to do some folds. I'm going to be doing folds kind of ongoing throughout all of that, and then at the end we'll open up to questions or just conversation. So I know that since most of y'all have experience baking, it's hard to keep a timeline on this stuff, but I'll do my best to wrap it up in about 90 minutes or so. But please, if you do have questions about stages, if you aren't very fluent in baking, just raise your hand, so to speak, so that I can tell you where we're at. But we are going to be jumping around just in the interest of compressing the class down into a good time frame. All right. So I'm going to start with the baguette recipe. If you can't tell, I'm a little bit of a Luddite, so I like things the old way, and we're going to hand mix today. These recipes today are applicable to a mixer. At our bakery, we have a fork mixer and an Artifex, a double arm diving arm mixer. But on small batch stuff, I love to hand mix. I love the intimacy of it. I love touching, and it's also, I think, the most critical way to teach people how to bake is not to stand in front of a machine and a digital timer, but to actually touch and to do and to learn. So we're going to do a small sample batch of the baguette recipe. We made a baguette before the pandemic called the maize baguette. We work with a family in southern Alabama that's grown the same corn since 1885. It's been in the family for 6 generations. We mill that corn into grits and to cornmeal, and we were making a sourdough baguette, a whole grain sourdough baguette called the maize baguette with toasted cornmeal from the farm that we mill in-house. So today we're doing something very similar. We're going to be making something just like the maize baguette, but the exception today is, of course, we're using some of the raspberries. I thought that a toasted cornmeal or toasted grits would set off flavor-wise very nicely with a raspberry. Zach and I chose to use the chunk raspberries, but if you want to use a puree, if you want to kind of hand press them or break them down, you can do however it is that you like. Another critical thing I'll say before I get going is that I don't like making breads or teaching breads that have an overwhelming amount of flavor of something besides the wheat and the leavening. So if you make this at home or something like it and you think, or you see on the recipe that the percentages are low when it comes to the inclusions, that's intentional because I want you primarily to taste the grain. I want you to taste, in this case, corn that's been grown by the same family for 150 years before you taste anything else in that dough. So again, if you want to add more or less, feel free to, but just know that my intention is always the nuance of the wheat should always be first and foremost, and always a stone milled whole wheat flour as well too. In a good, I guess, kind of modern tradition, I like to use yeast and levain. So we're going to be using a levain and a little bit of yeast today. Both of these doughs are retarded. So we're going to be baking this dough off tomorrow here at school. And then this is the batch of the heirloom grits and raspberry baguette dough that Zach mixed yesterday, and this was retarding overnight. So it's got a, I don't know if y'all can pick it up, but it's got a beautiful blonde color. Kind of these flecks of red from the raspberry, and the texture is very cakey and a little bit toothsome because of the cornmeal as well too. So it's a delicious bread, and a baguette is an arbitrary shape. So if you wanted to make a different shape with it, of course, feel free. All right, so on a hand mix, I'm going to add, it's a drier dough, so I'm not concerned about holding back any water. So I'm going to add all of my water off the bat. Can I have that? Yeah. Right. So I got my stone milled wheat flour here, my heirloom stone milled cornmeal here with a light toast on it, if you really want to set off some of those flavors, and then a little bit of roller milled white flour. I'm going to mix all those together. That's going to go into the water well. Thank you. I'm also going to add the levain. I know a lot of people have their opinions about when to add levain before an autolyse, but for me, because it's going to be about a 20-minute autolyse, I'm not too concerned about adding the levain now. My personal rule of thumb is if the autolyse is going to be more than like 30 minutes, I would not add the levain, but this is going to be a short autolyse, so I'm going to go ahead and add it now. On all of these doughs, I did a really young levain that was 100% hydration, and it was a 2-hour build, so it was equal parts water, flour, and mother going into that levain. So kind of a really young French style levain. I also have some cane syrup here. Again, going back to what I said earlier, use what you have. So if you have beet sugar where you're from, or if you have some great honey from a neighbor or a wonderful beekeeper where you're from, use that. Being in Louisiana, we obviously produce a whole lot of sugar cane. Unfortunately, for the amount of sugar cane that we produce in this state, we only have one certified organic producer. I've been working with Bob Romero for about 11 years, and he makes a wonderful cane syrup. His farm is called Three Brothers Farm. So if you do use a lot of sugar in your bakery or your shop, I definitely recommend reaching out to him. It's Three Brothers Farm, and they have a beautiful certified organic cane sugar from Louisiana. And again, he's a third generation Louisiana sugar farmer. I'm gonna hold this back for just a sec. I'll show you why. And I'm gonna get going on the hand mix. I'm gonna do what I call a claw method. So I'm just gonna take my hand, stir everything together in this stainless bowl. And then after it begins to kind of have a texture of everything kind of coming together, I'm going to do, again, what I call the claw. So I'm going to just clench my fist with dough in it and bring all that together. Y'all can see that. Okay. So really, this hand mix is not going to take more than maybe a minute. I'm not looking to knead it, do anything like that. Just gonna work it. I'm gonna take the mass of dough, or I can take a little bit of dough and clean up the edges on the bowl. So all the stray pieces of flour, I'll just kind of pick those up and clean those up. And as you can see, I have a pretty clean, simple mass of dough. All right, and then what I'm going to do with that cane syrup, like I told you earlier, I'm not going to add it immediately because it would be hard to trickle out because it's so viscous. So I'm going to take a little spot of dough and just run that spot of dough through the cane syrup to kind of pick it up. And then add that cane syrup to the top of the dough. Okay. I'm going to sprinkle the salt and the yeast on top. If for some reason you didn't want to use yeast, you could probably just double the levain in this formula and then not have to use the yeast. But I like the texture that yeast and levain combine together. Obviously levain, no matter how young it is always going to impart some sort of flavor to the dough. So I do like working with instant dry yeast in really small amounts when working with stone milled flour that's freshly stone milled, because it really allows that fresh flour to speak for itself without the interference of the souring components of a levain. And when they're together in really small amounts, they really add incredible keeping quality, and just the pairing and the acidity of the flavor is wonderful as well too when they're together. The raspberries, even though they're not a huge amount, I'm not going to add right now. I'm going to add after probably the second or third fold, because I don't want the rough or the bigger pieces of the raspberries to interfere with the gluten forming while everything is going on. All right. So I will set this aside. Thank you. That. All right. All right, so the next thing we're going to do, if we want to tilt that up, sure, that'd be great. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is, or that I'm going to do, always a third person. I'm going to proof check the fougasse and the baguettes that I shaped a little bit before class, and I'm going to divide the balance of the baguette and the fougasse dough that Zach mixed yesterday. All right. So yeah, if we can go back and get a zoom on this. So this is the raspberry and pistachio fougasse dough. It's got a beautiful dark color from all the flowers. I used some durum in here. I thought the durum would pair really well because it's very kind of buttery and almost milky of a flour. I thought it paired really well with the pistachios and the raspberries as well. Another, I think, flavor of flour that would work really well on a dough like this would be spelt or even rye. And one thing that's not on the recipe for the fougasse, but that Zach and I added, was some orange blossom water. Because again, I thought the orange blossom water would pair really well with the raspberries, the roasted pistachios, and the durum in the dough as well too. If you were to use a spelt flour instead of the durum in a dough like this with raspberries and pistachios, I'd recommend using rose water. I think that would pair really, really nicely as well too. And then everybody got a shot of this already, but this is the heirloom grits and raspberry baguette. All right? Jesse, may I have that board? Just be careful, yeah. Thank you. All right, so these are some baguettes I shaped about an hour ago. So they're getting pretty close to being baked. Probably, actually right after I do the divide, I think I'll put those in the oven. And then we have the fougasse over here. Which are also looking and feeling very great. Assuming everybody, again, knows a proof check, but just assuming maybe you don't. For me, a proof check, when the dough is gonna cradle my fingerprint, when it's only jumping back about 80, 90% of the way, I'm gonna start baking it. So the fougasse, I don't know how good the camera is, the fougasse is still pretty springy, okay? I want it to get a little bit more gassy, so I'm not gonna go on this. I'm gonna go on the baguettes before I go on the fougasse because they're very gassy and they're holding my fingerprint quite well. All right. You can leave that tilted down. I'm going to do the divide. Can I give this back to you, please? Thank you. So for the divide, for a bench flour, I typically just use like a roller milled white flour. You can use whatever you have around. And Jesse, can I have another board with a couche on it, please? Or a sheet tray, rather. I'm going to do my best to kind of loosen the edges of the dough from the tub. And then I'm going to really quickly invert it onto my floured work surface. This dough feels really beautiful. It's very soft and supple. It's got a beautiful color. It's got a wonderful aroma. But the color is really beautiful. It's kind of got this purplish hue from the combination of the buttery or the blonde durum with the red raspberries. And then it's studded throughout with some lightly roasted pistachios. Okay. So the way that I make fougasse is I just make the pre-shape the final shape. So I'm going to make a batard. At 550 grams. Okay. And for me, when I'm doing we're going to do basically a baguette pre-shape as the final shape for the fougasse. For me, the baguette pre-shape, I always do what I call a field goal. So I'm going to put my thumbs together and then kind of line up my index fingers and press and roll. I want these pre-shapes slash final shapes to be really tight because I want them to really pop in the oven. So I'm really going to give them probably, I don't know, like 4 or 5 rolls. It's not so much the number that matters, it's where the dough is at. So if the dough is, cold and dense, I wouldn't be too hard on it. If it's, active and gassy, I'd be a little bit firmer on it in order to encourage it fermenting a lot and then jumping in the oven. But whatever you do, it's critical that the dough gets a really nice tight shaping. So I'm going to kind of throw the back of the dough up and then press down with that field goal. Okay. And then seam, the seam, is going to go face up in the couche. All right? These doughs I wouldn't consider them wet, but if they do feel wet to you, or if any doughs, I guess in general, feel wet to you, I'd always err on the side of over-flouring a couche as opposed to under-flouring a couche, because it's of course easy to get rid of flour and brush it off than it is to deal with something that is sticky and ruining the couche, and in turn possibly ruining the dough if it is way too wet. So I tend to over-flour the couche and just brush off the excess. But of course, the patterning and the contrast and the color that white flour provides on a baked crust is beautiful as well too. So a nice amount of white flour is always good on couche, just for that color contrast. I'm going to do the second one. So again, that field goal with my thumbs just pressing down. I guess that was about eight rolls. But again, you can, or hopefully y'all can see that it's quite tight. Okay, seam up. And then the last one.
Chef, I have a question on hydration.
Yes.
I noticed that your hydration levels in this are on the higher side from what generally I'm used to. Is that
okay?
A product of the stone milled flour versus kind of your commercial roller milled flour?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to do one thing. My brain's a little bit messed up with kind of jump around a lot, but I was thinking that dates, walnuts, and raspberries would go really well together in a fougasse too. Sultanas, almonds with the raspberries. So there's just so many options with adapting a shape, whether it's fougasse or baguette or ciabatta, with the frozen raspberry puree or the whole raspberries. But just a lot of flavor options there. And then Zach's question is great. For those of you that aren't too familiar working with freshly stone milled flour, it definitely has a much higher percentage requirement than a roller milled flour would, whether that's a white roller milled or a whole wheat roller milled flour. But the critical thing to understand and to talk to your miller about is what is a hydration property of this flour, because just because it's stone milled and just because it's fresh, it could be a really weak flour with either a poor gluten quality or maybe a bad fouling number or whatever it may be, and it may leach water. So the best thing to do is to ask your miller, what can I expect on this flour in terms of hydration and protein? And the three people that I mentioned, Amber, Nan, and Jennifer, are all bakers, so they can obviously tell you all about what to use. Again, I think for those of us that aren't familiar with using a freshly stone milled flour, it's critical just to start thinking about flour as an ingredient in the same way that we think of raspberries as an ingredient, or sugar as an ingredient, or liqueur as an ingredient in chocolate. So ask your miller and tell them what it is that you have in mind. Do you want a pastry application? Do you want something buttery? Do you want something sweet? Do you want something that's dry for pizza dough that can take a lot of moisture? But again, start to think of flour as an ingredient that you should pair with the other things, either A, going into the bread, or B, going on top of it. So if you're making a pizza or a sandwich or whatever it may be. But I think that for way too long we've neglected flour as something that has its own autonomous flavor and just contribution to the loaf of bread or to the croissant or to the pastry or whatever else it is that we're making. But it's critical for me not to pile on cosmetics of sugar, salt, sweet, fat, distractions that are really masking low quality flour, and start with high quality main ingredient of an incredible stone milled flour. And your miller should and definitely needs to tell you what it is that you can look for, or what you can expect when you tell them what it is you're looking for with certain properties of a stone milled flour. So yes, that was a 5-minute answer for a 2-second question, but typically, as a rule of thumb, stone milled flours are going to take more hydration than roller milled flours. All right, next I'm really going to quickly divide the baguette. I'm going to do these at 450 grams. Thank you. Lightly floured work surface. The baguettes are going to get pre-shaped. So I'm going to put a little bit of flour down on the edge of my bench. And I'm going to do the same shape that I did with the fougasse. All right, so again, what I call the field goal. I'm not going to go as tight on these though, of course, because it's a baguette, so I want to do something a little bit looser, depending on where the dough's at, but this dough feels great. Not too gassy, not too cold, not too dense, so just probably going to give it, I guess, maybe 2. So there's 1, 2, and then I'll take the back of my hands, my pinkies, and push away. Okay. And make sure they're in a little kind of a flush of flour on the bench. Same thing here. Do 1, 2, and then my pinkies are going to push against the dough and the table at the same time. Okay. All right. One thing also again for flavors, I think buckwheat's an incredible flour and flavor, and I think it would pair incredibly with raspberries. So again, just kind of let your mind go wild, but there's a huge, I think, possibility to pair some buckwheat with some of these raspberries. All right. We've got a few minutes before I put the baguettes in the oven, so does anybody have any questions? Now would be a good few minutes.
How many different flours do you mill?
We were milling about 8 different flours.
8 different flours?
Yeah, yeah.
And where does you said kind of not generally our local area around here, but where do some of the flours come from? I know one of them was from Kansas. I saw that on the bag.
And then Oklahoma, we've been working with Oklahoma for a long time, and they grow quite a bit of wheat there. Sometimes Texas, North Carolina, Alabama for the corn. And yeah, there's a lot of grain cultivation up in North Carolina. Kentucky has a lot going on, and so does Tennessee. Yeah, so pretty much like a regional, like a nice regional scope of partners. Yeah.
And what are you looking at with the flours you're trying to source? Are you looking more for heirloom? Are you looking more for nutrition, or things that maybe forgotten grains, or kind of or is it just kind of all of the above? That's
a good question. I think for me, the most critical thing for the flour is just the quality of it. And, and primarily, I would hope that it would be organic, but growing practices, because I think that's another thing too that we kind of neglect as chefs or bakers, is that we have sometimes these assumptions or these parameters that we put on farmers, but we have no understanding of what their life is like or what they go through. So we live in a city and we tell them we want this 500-year-old wheat, but we have no understanding of how to make that possible. So I typically like to tell farmers what I'm looking for. So, you know, flavor, hydration, quality of seed, et cetera, and they kind of take that information and they say, this is what I have. So I like it to be more of a reciprocal relationship, as opposed to like, I'm on the marketplace and like, this is what I want. I'd rather go, and I do go to a farmer and say, this is what I'm looking for. What do you have that approximates this? And then what we'll do is we'll take that grain in and we'll do a sample batch before buying, you know, 100,000 pounds of it, and then just apply, as I said a few minutes ago, apply that flour to certain circumstances. So we have an organic soft white winter wheat, which would be terrible in a baguette, for example, or like wouldn't be good in like a hearth bread because the protein quality is not very high, but the flavor is incredibly nuanced and delicate. So it's incredible for cookies and scones and biscuits and brioche and all these other applications. So it becomes a matter of doing a little bit of homework on the quality of the wheat, but most importantly, just playing with it to learn about it.
Okay. Yeah. So that, you know, really, like we talked about, the product dictates the the starting where your starting point dictates your finish product. So
like any other chef, I mean,
Yeah.
a chef doesn't go to a farmer's market and says like, I don't like this cucumber because it's too green. Like they
Yeah.
make a decision about how to use that, or the tomato
Right.
that's got a lot of seeds. It's like they take what they're given as a chef, they take those ingredients and they decide how to work with them, but they allow the ingredients to dictate how they want to be worked with as opposed to vice versa.
Yeah.
And my hope as a baker is that we can all collectively as bakers start to approach ingredients, mainly grains, with that same attitude.
Yeah. And I think that's what really fascinates me about going to your bakery and kind of listening to you talk and kind of seeing what you're doing there. It's a shift of thinking about flour and about bread. And I think I told you earlier that I admire what you're doing with that. I think a lot of people do, honestly. Watching your social media and stuff too, you'll see a lot of people that
Thank you.
Outpouring of affection of like, hey, this is something that's really kind of magical. I think we were just talking about applying we'll call it farm to table, where like a chef would go to a farmer's market and talk and like, that cucumber dictates what you're going to make, and how Graison's now applying that to flour and into bread, kind of what the farmer has, and kind of developing that relationship the same way a chef would with, raising pigs or lamb or vegetables of some kind. So, and just applying that to bread, which is not something you see a lot. So,
Yeah.
which I think is kind of fascinating.
No, I appreciate that, and I think it's critical that we as bakers, you mind tilting that up? I'm talking to outer space.
Here we go. That's a little bit better.
Again, I think it's just critical that we as bakers hopefully want to just approach baking as every other aspect of our life, in the sense that we can choose, we have the privilege to choose what it is and how it is and how we want to work with something. And I think the main ingredient, or obviously the main ingredient in what we do is flour, but it's the most neglected ingredient in most of our bakeries. So I think it's critical, not just from a storytelling component for your customers, but I think ethically and economically and ecologically, it's really critical that we start to work with what's around us, as opposed to just because we're over here means we have to have the Parisian style baguette with white flour and poolish. That's a little bit redundant and kind of bored, I think, in 2020. And I think not just customers respond better to this, but I think our own creative impulses respond a lot better to this as well too. So I appreciate Zach for picking up on that we really are intentionally at Bellegarde doing our best to not just respond, but to really just enunciate what it is that we have surrounding us, and to really promote the people that put in the hard work of making the things that we use as well too, and allowing those ingredients to speak for themselves, and kind of backing up as much as possible from imposing flavor on those things, on those ingredients. All right, so now we're going to bake the baguette, because those are ready to go. So if I could please have those. Thank you. And if I could have the peel and the transfer peel. Jesse, may I give this back to you again? Just anywhere on that table is fine. Thank you. All right.
And I'm going to tilt down for you so you can see.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. So just like everything else that I've been talking about today, a person or a baker's oven situation is completely different from space to space. So we have an electric oven at the bakery and a natural gas deck oven. Here at the school, they have a natural electric deck oven. I like to bake hot, and if your customers, or if you don't like something that has a richer color to it, then of course, again, like the recipes from today are a guideline. They're not a rule. So just take them to your own circumstances and do what you want with them. But I like to bake hot. We're going to go into the oven at about 550, a pretty decent amount of steam. And honestly, I don't really have times on when things are finished. I bake according to color. So I would assume at 550, these baguettes are probably going to be done in about no more than 15, 20 minutes. But again, just adapt the recipe to your circumstance. All right. So I have these baguettes here. They've been proofing seam side up. So I'm going to take my transfer peel and flip them over. guess I'll just do 2. I have 3 to bake today. I'm going to make an epi out of 1, again, just like for variability for customers and just as bakers, it's nice to adapt the shape. When I was opening, to adapt the dough to different shapes. When I opened the shop 8 years ago, there was a bunch of people that wanted rolls, and I don't have any dividers, or the only machines in the bakery are the mixers and the mills. So I didn't want to make rolls, and the middle ground I found with the chefs that wanted rolls for dinner service was to make an epi. So again, like everything in the processing on these doughs is the same, except at the very last minute I'm going to use a pair of scissors to cut the dough as opposed to a blade. So for those of you who don't know what an epi is, it's French for wheat stock, and it's meant to resemble a stalk of wheat. So you can see the little pieces kind of coming off of it. I'm going to score this baguette. I think I put 6 scores on there. Can we pre-steam the oven, please?
Yes, top or second one down?
Second one down.
About 5 seconds?
Yeah, and as soon as I load, you can drop the temp to like 5:15.
Okay.
All right, and I'm going to load them in the oven. Can you get the door?
Yeah.
Oh, never mind. Don't steam, I got 1 more.
Okay.
And I got 1 more that did not fit too well on that peel. As I mentioned earlier, I like a lot of bench flour on the loaves. I like the aesthetic contrast that it provides. When I'm training people that work on the oven or the people that are shaping, I always ask them when it comes to dusting flour, how would you feel spending $3 or whatever on that loaf of bread and you got a mouthful of flour? So for me, it's critical to have enough dusting flour to provide aesthetic contrast, but I don't want clumping or anything. I know you guys can't see, but I don't want people to bite into a mouthful of flour. I want them to bite into a mouthful of bread. So if there is excessive flour, you can gently scrape it off with the blade or a table brush or whatever else. Thank you. All right, now you can steam.
Another 5 seconds?
Just, yeah, 3 seconds is fine. Thank you. Can I have the fougasse?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, so these are the fougasse from yesterday. They feel great, but I need to do some work on the mix, so I'm gonna let them sit out for just a little bit longer to talk about the mix that we're doing, the hand mix, and then we'll come back and bake off the fougasse. Is there a way to show them the oven?
Yeah, I can kind of.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I can zoom in too much, but.
So the baguettes look great. Really nice jump on them. The smell in here is wonderful from the corn and the raspberries. The camera guy's nodding his head, so that's always a vindication. All right, so back to the mix. I know I wasn't taking time, so I'm sure I went a little bit over the 20-minute auto lease, but again, you know, you can be flexible on yourself. I'd say for me as a rule, if I'm going over on the auto lease, I'll just reduce the overall bulk fermentation time. So let's say I was 20 minutes late on incorporation and my first fold, then I'll just reduce the bulk by 20 minutes or whatever it is. And I guess just to be clear, an auto lease is when you combine the flour, the water together before you actually add the leavening. As I said earlier, I add a little bit of levain to the auto lease because it was a small amount in this mix. And the purpose of an auto lease, I would say, is kind of like a first date. So as opposed to jumping into things right away, you kind of get to know each other. It's critical when using so-milled flour for an auto lease because you really want the water to hydrate properly with that so-milled flour. the molecules and the granules in stone mill flour are so different than roller milled flour. So it's really a matter of coating all those orbs of stone mill flour with that water, as opposed to jumping right into a mix as you would with the roller milled flour. So a minimum of 20 minutes of an autolyse is ideal for stone mill flours, and anywhere up to an hour or two is also wonderful as well too. But it really just allows for proper hydration and dough properties when using stone mill flour. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to that claw method that I did earlier. I have my salt, cane syrup, and yeast on top of the dough, and I'm going to really lightly incorporate it in with the claw. So again, like, I don't want to knead it, I just want to incorporate it. So that's maybe going to be like, count to 20. The dough feels great. Just after that autolyse, just really, really supple. It felt soupy at first, but it's already, I mean, look how strong it is already, if y'all can see. So all I'm looking for at this stage is incorporation of the salt and the yeast and the cane syrup into the bigger mass of the dough. And again, just using the claw method. If you need a little bit of water for your hand, go ahead. Also, according to your skill set or your customer basis or whatever it is, add some more hydration either at this point or a little bit later down the road. But again, the recipe I provided today is a trampoline for you to kind of jump off of. So this is, I guess, a moister dough, but it's a baguette. It's full of corn, which doesn't have gluten, so I didn't want something that was super wet and that would make the handling really difficult. So I dropped the hydration a little bit more normally than I would, because I was conscientious about the corn not having gluten, and a baguette requires a lot of handling, so I didn't want something too wet that would cause a mess on the shaping table. And also because it contains corn and raspberries, I'm not going for some Instagram crumb shot with all the holes and the white flour and all that stuff. I'm more interested in flavor and nutrition, not in the size of the air bubbles. All right, so everything is incorporated into that dough, and I'm sorry that there's that reflection, but it's just beautiful. It's all incorporated. It's nice and smooth. It's just a really beautiful, clean, nice dough. I'm going to let it rest for about 20-30 minutes and then start doing my folds on it. As I said earlier, I'm going to add the raspberries probably after the second fold, but I want to give the dough some time to kind of acclimate to itself before adding these big chunks of things that are going to interrupt the gluten. So that's why I'm not adding the raspberries first. And there's not a lot of liquid in these raspberries, so if anyone was concerned about, well, you're missing out on hydration, it's really not that much hydration in these raspberries, so we're not going to be missing out too much on the final dough. All right, any questions on the mix?
Chef, you mentioned hydration. I'm sorry, hydration, nutrition.
Yes.
And so is the stone ground flour have any nutrition benefits over a roller milled flour?
Yeah, that's a great question. Stone milled,
yeah,
kick that out.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah, so stone mill flour, I'm not a scientist. I've been doing this for a while, but I'm definitely not a scientist. But stone mill flour basically preserves all the nutritional properties of whether it's wheat or corn or rye, whatever you're milling. The stone mill, the two stones can't segregate different parts of that grain. So they don't know the difference between the germ or the bran or the endosperm. Unlike roller milling, which their whole intention in a roller mill is to segregate different parts in order to make different flours. But with stone milling, it's one shot. It's typically just a single pass. So you're preserving all the nutritional benefits that come in that grain by stone milling. And then by adding sourdough, it's through the roof in terms of how much quality food's available for your body. And then if you're retarding it, it makes things even better in terms of nutritionally, just what's available for your body, but also digestibility too. So as I think most of us know, like sourdough is a huge factor in increasing digestibility for breads. And if you're retarding it, it's even better. And then if you're using stone mill flour, it's even that much better. So
from the stone mill aspect, you're putting all the good stuff you possibly can into that
You're preserving
into
it.
that.
So again, like you can think about it from like nose to tail. So
Right.
like you're not going to kill a whole pig and then just go for the bacon.
Right.
Which, as an analogy, is kind of what they're doing when they make roller milled white flour. Stone milled flour is nose to tail flour, and everything is available for your body when you're using that whole grain flour.
And then with the long fermentation, that really makes it even more
You're
available
facilitating,
for
yeah.
digestion.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's not like professional studies that have been done, but Steve Jones that runs the Bread Lab, he told me that if you can do like a minimum of 25% whole grain stone mill flour in a dough, you're doing something good for your body. Anything beneath that is like, it's not redundant, but he said at the 25% threshold, you're really making a difference. So that would be the minimum. Our breads at the bakery, the whitest one is 30% whole grain. And then our ciabatta, I think, is 80 or 85% whole grain, and then the rest of the breads are 100% whole grains. Yeah. Okay. But that's a great question. I'm going to go on to the fougasse right now. I will bake that off. All right, so the fougasse is a bread from, the shape of the fougasse is a bread from southern France. Traditionally it has like shallots, lardons, you can do anchovies, but I like to kind of just take traditional shapes and just use local ingredients or just use ingredients that I like and use the format of that shape to achieve what it is that I want when it comes to flavor and to ingredients. So as you saw, we took the traditional French baguette shape, but we stuffed it full of heirloom cornmeal and raspberries from Washington. And then with this fougasse, we're taking the fougasse shape and adding the roasted pistachios and the raspberries to it. So typically the fougasse is made in like a ladder shape. I will make 2 different shapes today, but they're really beautiful. Customers typically really, I think, find them very stunning visually. Sometimes a little bit taken aback by how to eat them, so that would take a little bit of effort, I think, on your part as the baker or the owner or whomever, encouraging people just how to eat these and how to enjoy them, because they may be a little bit overwhelming aesthetically, but they really are beautiful. They're beautiful for centerpieces and for big meals as well too. The traditional way too to bake the fougasse when it comes out of the oven is to brush it with olive oil. I'm not going to do that today, but feel free again to do that at home if you wanted to. Another nice option for this fougasse, because we use some orange blossom water, would maybe be doing a simple syrup reduction with some orange blossom water mixed into it, and then brushing the fougasse as soon as they come out with that mixture as well too. That just adds a little bit more nuance to it, and I think it's important to kind of lend what's inside to the outside as well too. So a little bit of orange blossom water and sweetness on the outside to kind of match the orange blossom water that's on the inside of the dough. All right, so just like I showed y'all earlier, these were proofed seam side up. So here's my first one. I'm gonna do these one at a time because my peel's a little bit small. And I really like the amount of flour I have on here, because again, you're gonna see when the breads come out, just visually how nice they are when they have a decent patterning of white flour on them to provide that contrast against the dark dough. I'm gonna take this orange scraper. I like the narrow side on this. And I'm just gonna press the dough all the way down to the peel and then open it up. It's best to do fougasse either on parchment or directly on the peel or your loader, because if I were to do this on my workbench, it would not be fun trying to lift up this big cut piece of dough and transfer it onto the peel to load it in the oven. So I'm gonna cut directly on here. At the bakery, we cut fougasse directly on the loader, the deck oven, and then just load it right off the bat. If you have something that's greasy or there's something in it, you can just bake it on top of a piece of parchment. So again, I'm cutting all the way to the floor, all the way to the bottom of the peel, and then I'm opening the dough as I cut it. So cutting and opening. If you leave the dough touching, it's gonna bake touching together. So I don't wanna do that. I want it to be separated. If the dough feels a little bit tight, you can kind of open it up like this If you feel that after you cut it, it's jumping back together, you want to kind of open it up like this and make sure that all these cuts are autonomous. All right? Can you steam, please?
Yes, sir.
I'm also going to do, I have 2 mini ones, so I'll do those quick, or one of those behind the big ones. If you're doing mini fougasse, a 3-in-1 paint scraper without paint on it is really nice of a tool to use. But anything with a small kind of a sharp edge is really ideal, especially if you want to get into some more decorative designs on the fougasse. So a clean 3-in-1 that has not been used at a construction site is really nice. All right.
There's a lot of flavor in that paint, though, Chef. I don't know. But
I mean, these days, maybe you can use a chloroquil 3-in-1. I don't know if I can make COVID jokes. This is a little bit wide. Do you guys have anything more narrow than this?
let me find out. See if that can work.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jesse.
That'll work? Okay.
Yeah. Can y'all see that small one in the back? Okay. I do have a few pistachios falling out, so I can just kind of pop them back on once I do all the cutting. And this guy, I don't know if y'all can see, but this one is kind of giving me a little bit of grief on the tension. Maybe it could have used another 10 minutes on the proof, but I wanted to get things in the oven so we have some bread out by the end of class. So just make sure that if it is giving you tension, if y'all can see that, I want to really just open up the cuts to make sure they don't bake into each other. But I think for the purpose of today, hopefully that can be forgiven by y'all. I got a few extra pistachios I'm just going to pop in to the top of the dough and load these in.
About 3?
You can, yeah, and then dip the temp down again, please. And can we, do you have a vent on here, or should I just open the door? Okay.
It's a small vent, but you can open the door too.
Okay,
if you
and
want
just
to.
turn this deck off, please, the
Okay.
baguette deck. So these are the heirloom grits baguettes and the epi. They smell wonderful. I am going to put them back in the oven though. I just wanted to show y'all, but they're, I don't know how long they've been in.
It's been about a little over 15 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to give them another
17, 18 or so.
Okay, probably another 5-10 minutes just for a little bit more, get some of that moisture out, but they smell great, they look really good. And again, I just kind of want to firm up the color and give them a little bit more, bake out some of that moisture a little bit more. All right. All right, now I'm going to shape the baguettes. Going to lightly dust the couche. Again, especially with the darker dough, I just like to use a really simple roller milled white flour as a bench flour. I'm assuming these are ready to go. Yeah. So what is the top? I'm going to flip over. Again, I'm going to do that field gold method again. So I'm going to put my thumbs together and put my index fingers up. I'm going to fold the top half over to the middle and press down. Flip it and do the same thing. Fold the top half over, fold down. Then I'm going to take my thumb and the palm of my hand and flip that dough in half. I'll do the next one hopefully so y'all can see it a little bit better. But basically I have a tube right now. I'm going to keep my eye on that seam. I want that seam facing up. I'm going to start with one hand, apply pressure through my wrists, and just roll out the dough. I like little tapers on the end. Do what you want. Okay, and then I'll make a pleat with the couche, make the little wall, and go on to the next one. So again, that field goal, folding it on the top, flipping it, folding it on the top. And now basically what I'm doing is I'm creating a hollow kind of tube with my thumb, and I'm going to flip the dough over and then seal it with the palm of my right hand. So I'm going to flip that right here. I'm putting my thumb right where that line is and then sealing it with my palm. Okay, seam side up. Start with one hand. That pressure is coming from your wrist, not from your fingers. Your wrists are the engine and your fingers are the wheels. So all that power and all the torque is coming from your wrist. You're applying pressure and pressing the dough against the table. Find your seam, seam side up, and then it goes in the couche, seam side up. If you get like a chunk of raspberry, just a little bit of extra flour is fine. You can see this guy is pretty wet. So that field goal, a little bit more flour, flipped it over, same side, thumb, folding the dough, going back to the seam. Seam is facing up. I'm starting with one hand, applying pressure from my wrists. And then I'm going to finish with the taper. Okay. And I got one last small one. Okay, seam up again. I don't know if everyone knows what a ficelle is, but a ficelle is basically like a really long, skinny baguette. So we can just make a ficelle, or I'll make a ficelle with this. I'm going to make it the length of my couche. I guess always make sure that you have a transfer peel that's also the length of your couche. And typically these aren't tapered, so I won't taper the ficelle. Something I thought about but didn't do was to cover these heirloom corn baguettes in cornmeal or something on the outside, or grits, but it would add like a really nice kind of toothy texture to it, and the aroma would be awesome, but it would really interrupt the scoring. So I decided not to do that. But if you make something like this in a different format, I'm sure that you could put some cornmeal, roll it in cornmeal ahead of time, or grits, just to give it that extra aroma and extra flavor. All right, so these are going to proof. Again, depending on the ambient temperature of your kitchen, I'd say maybe like an hour to an hour and a half for the final proof, but we are in New Orleans and it's super hot here and super hot today. So these took about an hour and a half to proof for the demo. The northerner question. So that's a great question. What's the difference between grits and cornmeal? It's just the grind. And polenta is basically like Italian for cornmeal. I know there's a lot of people that would crucify me for that, but polenta is just a very fine grind on corn. And grits are just, you can think of cornmeal should have the texture of wet sand or like a sablé cookie, and grits are going to have something a little bit more coarser. Okay, so it's really just the size of the grind, and it doesn't change the flavor, it doesn't change the nutrition, it just changes the texture, the mouthfeel. When baking, it depends how much corn you're using, but if you want something more absorbent, I would recommend using cornmeal because it's finer, whereas the grits are going to be a little bit more toothy. Another tactic would be to make a porridge out of the grits and then add that porridge to the dough if you wanted to, but I like things a little bit more simpler than that. So just like a quick roast on that cornmeal or the grits to give them that aroma and that flavor, and then just add them straight off to the dough. I guess the spectrum is going to be like corn flour, cornmeal, polenta, and then grits. And then just to mess everybody up even more, like grits is a whole spoke of like people grind grits in different sizes and textures and everything else. So, okay, so corn flour, cornmeal, polenta, and then grits. All right? Can you pull those out, please?
Sure.
I'm going to grab the dough. I always like to toast stuff on a low temperature because, you know, being a bakery owner, you got 10,000 things going on, so I don't have a good memory when it comes to knowing what I need to pull out of the oven. So I like to toast bran or cornmeal at probably like 250, 300 degrees and just kind of like slow and low on a piece of parchment. You don't want it to pick up any color per se, you just kind of want that aroma and flavor, or the aroma to kind of come out of it on that slow and low toast. So I would say a sheet tray cornmeal at 300 degrees for 30 minutes or so. The best thing is if you're unsure, take a spoon, take a scoop of that cornmeal out of the oven, let it cool, and come back 2 minutes later and taste it, and that'll be the final product. So if you want something a little bit more aromatic or denser in flavor, let it go longer. If you want something a little bit more lighter with just a hint of that corn flavor, take it out early. I don't know, I definitely haven't had a day off and I have not been bored unlike some other people I know during the pandemic, but if you happen to be one of those people, I hope you're enjoying it for the rest of us. And a cool project to work on is nixtamalizing. So the ancient Mexicans, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Mayans, and the Aztecs, they found that if you treated corn with wood ash, you could just release incredible nutritional the nutritional value of corn by treating it, soaking it, and boiling it in wood ash. You could do that today by using dolomite powder or slake lime or whatever it is, but basically nixtamalizing is a preparation for making corn into a tortilla. So it adds that kind of familiar bite that we're all used to with the traditional whole grain tortilla. I can't really describe it. It's kind of like having a pretzel that's been dipped in lye versus a pretzel that hasn't. But if you wanted to nixtamalize corn and then mill it and then roast it, it adds a whole other incredible dimension of flavor and nutrition, whether it's to like a bread dough or like a cookie or obviously a tortilla. So it's really incredible. There's a lot of instructions online. It's really simple. It's basically just adding some sort of calcium or lye to the corn, letting it soak, boiling it, and then letting it soak again, rinsing it off to get the pericarp, that plastic outer aspect of the corn off, and then milling it or grinding it in the Vitamix, and then making whatever it is that you want with it. But that's called nixtamalizing corn. And again, you can find a lot of resources online. There's an incredible group of guys and women in Mexico called Masienda. It's M-A-S-C-I-E-N-D-A, Masienda, and they're working with heirloom growers in Mexico with heirloom varieties of corn, where corn is from, and you can buy their stuff. I don't think that their shipping has been interrupted because of COVID, but they're working with incredible producers and incredible varieties. So Masienda is an awesome resource to get corn, but I think corn domestically has seen a really big kind of heirloom resurgence. So maybe contact your local mill or some local farmers at the market, but you can do that to either a dent corn or to a flint corn, but I don't think you can nixtamalize a popping corn, nor is that really meant for baking or anything else. I've got the baguette dough now. I think it's been about 20 minutes has elapsed since I last incorporated the salt and the yeast. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna dip my fingers in a, do you mind
Sure.
tipping that down, please? I'm going to dip my fingers in a little bit of water, and I'm going to fold the dough. And I usually demo the folds on a towel before I actually do it on the dough. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring the edges of the dough to the middle. Okay. And there's no real number. It's relative to what the dough will let you do. So if the dough is fighting you, if it's tearing and it's really stiff, then stop. Listen to the dough. If the dough is really wet and slack and you can give it more folds, that's cool too. But listen to the dough. Don't force anything on it. Just listen to where it's at. I'm going to give this a series of folds. I don't think that you guys are going to be able to see all of them, but again, like 3, 4, 5 folds for this dough until it just has a nice kind of strong bouncy texture. And then, as I said, I'm going to add the raspberries probably after the second or third fold. So just going to dip my fingers in some water, lift up the dough. I'm going to stretch it to the point of tearing. So it's pretty high, but it's beginning to tear. I don't want to do that. I just did that for demo purposes. So pull it up, turn the bowl. This is a very small batch, so I'm not going to ferment it overnight in this bowl. I'm going to, I got to the end of the folds, so I want that seam. I want everything that I folded on top of to be on the bottom, so I'm going to flip that over. You don't want to ferment this overnight in a stainless steel bowl. You want to ferment this in a tub, preferably a bus tub with a very light coating of oil on it or light coating of water on it. But I wouldn't fold it in the bin that you mixed it in unless you clean that bin really well. Otherwise, the dough is going to cling to all the stuff that's on the walls of the bowl, and it's going to interrupt the fermentation. All right. How are the fougasse?
I think they're looking pretty good.
Let's let me pull those out and show the folks.
Here.
Go. Thank you. All right, here's the first 2 fougasse. Y'all see? They smell great again, but color is not there for me. I'm sure some people would probably take these out now, but for me, these have a good 5 or 10 minutes. And I'm only saying that by looking at it. I don't know how long it's been in. I'm not going to pop a thermometer in it and see what the internal temp is. Like I want a certain color to the bread, and these are not there yet. So I'm going to pop them back in, but I just wanted to show y'all what the first round of the fougasse looked like. So it's about 5:30 our time. Can we maybe open it up to questions? Because the only thing that we have left to do is to pull out the fougasse and then to wrap up 1 or 2 more folds onto the baguette dough. So it would probably be a good time, not even for questions, but just for discussions or anything else that folks have in mind, maybe about something that I said or something that I didn't say that y'all need clarification on, or whatever y'all want.
Talking about the bake, Chef, you do, I think what someone described as an aggressive bake with your breads, get much darker. Mm-hmm. I find that to be more flavorful than breads that are baked a little bit lighter. So that's just, I guess we want to,
yeah.
We can talk a little bit more about that if you want, but I mean, I agree with your, I guess, what some refer to as an aggressive bake, which I guess is a polite way of putting it, but.
Yeah, I think just bringing out the full caramelization and the fermentation is really critical, because you're going through, like on a dough like the ones that we did today, you're going through all the work of fermenting them overnight and doing the levain and doing all that stuff. And if you're going to bake it really blonde and not pull out all the colors that are inherent in that fermentation of having been retarded, then I think you're kind of doing it a disservice. So it's, for me, primarily it's a flavor thing. It's an aesthetic thing, but it's also just kind of carrying the whole process through of going through all the work of fermenting it overnight and wanting it to have all that stuff at the end of the bake as well too. So giving it like a really strong bake. Yeah.
I tell my students it's like, having a piece of white bread versus toasting that piece of white bread, which is going to have more flavor. So it's developing that flavor from it. So. And
I think for people that have bakeries or restaurants or whatever, the rule for me has always been let the customer decide. So I can't stand chefs that, I work with, like the bread is too dark or the bread is too whatever. It's like they don't, you know, people don't go to your restaurant because they want to tell you how to make your food. They go to your restaurant because they like the food that you make. And I think bakers need a little bit more self-confidence to bake how they want to bake. I know, God forbid, like we do what it is that we want to do, but I don't want to bake light bread and I don't want to bake white bread. And if people want that, that's fine with me, but it's not who we are and it's not what we do. So occasionally maybe we'll have some stuff that's on the darker side or some stuff that may be on the lighter side. But again, it's the customer's prerogative to choose what they want. And I think that the bakers, you know, we should have more confidence with who we are and what we do to provide options for the customer. But at the end of the day, they're coming for us and for what we love to do.
If you wanted to show, I mean, you do have your flour laid out here on the board, and this is some of the wheat flour, whole wheat flour that we have here at the school.
Sure.
You can kind of see the difference between some of those as well. So I'll pan that down if you wanted to play with that. So we can see. There we go.
Yeah, so Zach,
get a little closer.
On the board here, I don't know how much nuance y'all are able to see, but
I'm going to try and get a little bit closer, so bear with me, guys. Try not to do a Blair Witch Project thing with it, but I don't think it's working. So I think we got a pretty good shot of that, as close as we can, I think, get it. But.
So right here I have a commercially roller milled whole wheat flour. I have the Durham flour, which we milled in-house at Bellegarde, which is grown in Arizona. This is our wheat flour right here. Oh, excuse me, this is the cornmeal. I'm sorry, this is the heirloom cornmeal. And this is our wheat flour from Bellegarde right here. Okay. So, can y'all see the different?
That's a good close-up.
All right. Thank you.
Do you want a longer one?
Yeah, do you have a little bit bigger? Thank you, Jesse.
Should be in that top drawer somewhere.
I'm going to do a fold on the dough here. I'm a little bit early. I like to do folds at like 30-minute intervals, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to do an early fold, and then we'll slice the bread. So again, I'm just grabbing the edges, dropping it down. I'll pull it from the back so y'all can see. And then that part that took all of the folds, that seam, I want to flip it down. I want it to be face down. So I'm going to flip that down. And again, just in the interest of time, I'm going to add the raspberries to this. And we can do the same thing that we did with the cane syrup. Just take a little piece of the dough, because this is all food. I don't want to waste that. I'm just going to take a piece of dough and kind of clean up the deli container to get all that liquid out. And again, you're the chef, you're the baker, so if you want something with a chunky texture like this, then go for it. If you want something that's more fine, use a puree, use a concentrate, but again, just decide what you want and what you want that final loaf to taste like and to feel like, and add the raspberries or any other ingredients accordingly. All right, I'm gonna cut the breads. We just pulled the fougasse out. It's obviously a little bit warm. You can see the beautiful patterning on it from that flour. And then just as I was talking to Arlo earlier, and just reminding everyone that this is 100% whole wheat, 100% whole grain. Hand mixed too, no machines or anything. overnight retard with a little bit of levain and yeast. Okay. You can see, I always like to illustrate with an unperfect example just to show that we're all fallible and imperfect. You can see these little fougasses, especially like down here where I didn't open it enough. Can everyone see that? So these are nice kind of openings on the fougasse, but this is a little bit tight. So maybe that means that because the dough was fighting me a little bit, I could have waited and given it a little bit longer proof time. Same with this one. It's a little bit tight down here. This one has very nice openings on it, the cuts. But again, it's always nice to illustrate with something that's a little bit, less than perfect. So this could have used a little bit more opening on it. Maybe the tool was a little bit small. One really important trick that I like to tell people, not a trick, but especially in a commercial setting, if you're unsure about the dough being ready to bake, but you have a whole tray of it, then just bake one and see what it looks like. You don't need to it's not like the casino and you're gonna go all in with everything that you have and just see what happens. But if you are unsure about this fougasse being ready, then take a little piece of it, bake it off and see how it behaves for 5 minutes in the oven, and then decide if you want to bake the rest of it or hold it back a little bit longer. All right. So I guess I'll cut some of these a little bit. I know it's a little bit awkward because we can't taste it and we can't share it, but I'll
taste it for him.
Okay. Cut the baguette. So again, I'm not going for, like a crumb shot on this baguette because it's got a lot of corn in it, which has no gluten. It was a hand mix. So, I mean, it's not like a terrible crumb, but again, I'm not going for some huge thing. It was also, 50% whole grain and 15% corn. So I wasn't going for those huge pockets or anything like that. You can see that most of the raspberries kind of baked off a little bit. There's a few kind of residual ones on the top here, but I like that you can't necessarily see it in a sense. It's nice to have these up here, but I like that the aroma of the raspberries is kind of in there, even though you can't see them. But that's obvious because they got baked off in the process of us baking the dough. But it's a beautiful color. I think y'all can see pretty well. It smells really good. And flavor is really good as well too. I don't know if you want to take that. Mm-hmm. The epi came out really nice as well too. And the fougasse is still a bit warm, but I'm sorry, can I have the knife back?
Yes.
Okay, and there's the fougasse. All right. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.